One of the difficulties facing economics is that we can't run experiments like natural scientists, right? We can't, get in a lab usually and see, all right, well, let's try these institutions in this country, these institutions in that country, and then we'll have some control countries that don't have any institutions. That's not going to work, all right? It's not possible. And so a lot of times in economics, what we look for are so-called natural experiments, right? Where history gives us to countries or to schools or to students or to households that start off more or less in the same place, but then get separated because of some historical accident or some policy. And then we can see how they diverge. And so, one way to look at this is by looking at countries that started off with similar institutions but then got separated, right? So we could look at, North and South Korea. We can look at East and West Germany, as this graph does. And we can see that, at least in the German case, it does appear that West Germany, which had more capitalist institutions, grew much faster than East Germany, which had more communist institutions. Um, we can see that Spain took a while to grow, but then grew pretty fast in the 60s before slowing down in the late 70s and early 80s. And Japan grew very fast through about 1975, 1980, and then slowed down a bit. So looking at institutions and the differences between countries can really help us see that it looks like capitalism is uh, a requirement in order to get this hockey stick growth where GDP per capita really can grow uh, very quickly. If we look at another group of countries, so this is a group that includes a number of countries, some of which were richer to begin with, some of which were poorer, we can see that some were able to really grow fast, in this case, South Korea, whereas others have really struggled. So if we look at this, Argentina was the richest country in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, but then they've really struggled to grow since about 1970. They have grown some, and they're the second richest country in this uh, group. But South Korea was really able to put the institutions in place to grow very quickly after the Korean War. Um, Interestingly, they did so under what was basically a military dictator, although now, of course, they are a democracy. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with China, which has also been able to grow very fast, whether or not that country will be able to continue to grow without adopting democracy. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, right? So, not all capitalist economies are going to be equally successful. You could certainly argue that Argentina and South Korea are both capitalist economies, but with somewhat different institutions. And so you have to look at the economic conditions, you have to look at the political conditions, and you also have to look at the role that government plays. Are they educating everybody? Are they providing roads and electrical grids and all the things that are needed for a country really to grow? We can see South Korea was very successful in that. These other countries were less successful, right? Botswana is one of the bright parts of sub-Saharan Africa. We can see that Russia really hasn't grown that quickly. Nigeria has started to grow since around 2000. They have a lot of oil, and that has helped them somewhat. But they're still, I think, in the process of adopting institutions that will be required. So if we think about political systems, obviously capitalism is going to exist within those political systems, and political systems sometimes are going to be very helpful and sometimes are going to be very unhelpful in terms of helping an economy grow. So that's going to, include individual rights of citizens in a democracy. It's going to include fair elections. But we do see countries that have capitalism and non-democratic systems too. We mentioned South Korea and China already. And I think, as we've seen, especially in China recently, they've been able to have decades of very fast growth to move from a very poor country to a middle income country. and it's going to be very interesting to see whether that can continue without a democratic government. And it's possible it can, and it's possible it can't. I don't know. So when capitalism struggles, it's usually because of the political institutions, right? So private property is not secure. So people don't know whether or not the government is going to come take their land, their company, or criminals are going to come take their land or their company. Markets are not competitive, right? So there's no competition that is providing incentives to generate new products and services and decrease costs. Or its firms are not allowed to grow and die because of the market, but instead of because of their connections to the government or because of who they are, right? And if that's the case, then capitalism is not being allowed to work, and we'll see that it doesn't end up providing that level of growth that other countries have experienced. So if we think about, the countries that have really been successful, it's when the institutions allow for, private incentives for innovation, right? So private property is secure, there's market competition. Firms are led by leaders who are there because they have proven to be successful, and if they stop being successful, either those leaders are going to be out or those firms are going to fail. And then public policy that supports this. So, one of the things that South Korea did was go from a low literacy country to a universal literacy country, making sure everybody can read, right? That's got to be one of the main things that a government does, but also things like infrastructure. All of the things that are needed to grow are usually in the hands of government. A stable society, obviously a biophysical environment, and resource-based resources can be pretty important, but I just saw an article about the Netherlands, which does not have the best agricultural land, but they've been able to, through technology, become one of the main agricultural exporters because of their sort of greenhouse growing expertise. Finally, another way to look at the government is through how much tax revenue it collects, right, in terms of a percentage of GDP. And you can see that while these are all fairly successful capitalist countries, right, this is the OECD, uh, the percent of tax revenue goes from about 25% in Mexico to over 50% in Norway, with the US being the second lowest. And so there's lots of different ways for a government to arrange itself and to be involved in the economy that can still be successful. And so that's just another thing to remember.